Have you ever noticed something strange? Every time you avoid doing something important, your brain immediately gives you a perfectly reasonable explanation. I'm too tired. I'll do a better job tomorrow. I should learn a little more first. This isn't the right time. None of those thoughts sound ridiculous. That's exactly what makes them dangerous. Your brain almost never says, let's avoid the work. Instead, it says, let's be responsible. Let's be prepared. Let's wait until we can do it properly. The excuse changes. The outcome stays the same. You don't start. Most people think procrastination feels like laziness. It usually doesn't. It feels like common sense. That's why it's so difficult to recognize. Imagine you have an important project to work on. You sit down, open your laptop, and within seconds your mind starts negotiating. Maybe I should organize my notes first. Maybe I should answer a few messages. Maybe I should make some coffee. Maybe I should watch one more video about this topic. None of those things are bad. In fact, they all sound productive. But together they quietly achieve one thing. They delay the uncomfortable part. The strange thing is that your brain doesn't care whether the story is true. It only cares whether the story successfully moves you away from uncertainty. Because uncertainty feels uncomfortable. Action creates uncertainty. So your brain starts writing explanations that make avoidance feel intelligent. Think about how rarely your thoughts sound honest. Your brain almost never says, I'm afraid this won't be good enough. Instead, it says, I just need a little more preparation. It doesn't say, I'm afraid to fail. It says, this idea still needs work. It doesn't say, I don't want to face uncertainty. It says, tomorrow will be a better day to start. The story sounds different. The destination stays exactly the same. That's why some excuses become so powerful, not because they're true, because they're believable. And the more intelligent you are, the more convincing those stories can become. A creative mind doesn't only solve problems. It also creates explanations, sometimes brilliant ones. That's why intelligence can become a strange advantage and a strange disadvantage at the same time. If you're creative, you can come up with endless possibilities. Unfortunately, that includes endless reasons not to act. You can explain why the timing isn't right, why the market isn't ready, why the idea still needs work, why another week of preparation would make everything better. Each explanation sounds thoughtful on its own. Together, they quietly become a substitute for action. The problem isn't that you're thinking too much. The problem is that your thinking has stopped moving you forward. Have you ever noticed that you can explain almost anything after you've already decided? You skip the workout. Now there must be a reason. You don't publish the project. Now there must be a reason. You avoid making the phone call. Now there must be a reason. The explanation often comes after the decision, not before it. Your brain simply fills in the blank. Think about how often you've changed your mind after taking the first step. A project that felt impossible suddenly becomes manageable. A conversation you were avoiding turns out to be completely ordinary. A workout you almost skipped ends up feeling good. Nothing outside of you changed. The task didn't become easier. The uncertainty simply disappeared once you started moving. That's something your brain almost never predicts. It predicts how uncomfortable beginning will feel. It almost never predicts how quickly that discomfort fades. That's why your thoughts before action and your thoughts after action often sound like they came from two different people. That's one of the reasons self-awareness is so difficult. You don't experience your excuses as excuses. You experience them as reality. That's what makes your own mind so difficult to question. You don't hear your thoughts as opinions. You hear them as facts. When someone else tells you to wait, you naturally become skeptical. But when the same advice comes from your own mind, it feels trustworthy by default. After all, who would know you better than you? Sometimes the answer is surprising. Your habits know you better than your thoughts do. That's why two people can face the exact same situation and tell completely different stories about it. One person thinks, this is difficult, but I'll figure it out. The other thinks, I'm probably not ready yet. The situation didn't change. The story did. One story leads to action. The other leads to waiting. And after enough repetitions, the story starts feeling like your personality. You begin saying things like, I'm just an overthinker. I'm someone who needs more time. I always work better under pressure. Maybe. Or maybe those are simply stories you've repeated so many times that they stop sounding like stories. One of the strangest things about the human mind is that repetition creates familiarity. And familiarity feels like truth. Not because it is true, because you've heard it often enough. That's why your own thoughts deserve the same question you would ask anyone else. Is this actually true? Or is it simply convenient? Notice something. Whenever your brain wants you to delay something uncomfortable, it almost never offers an emotional argument. It offers a logical one. That's why it feels so persuasive. Logic is much harder to argue with than emotion. If your brain simply said, I don't feel like doing this, you'd probably recognize what was happening. Instead, it says, you'll do higher quality work if you wait. Or, you should gather a little more information first. Maybe that's true. Sometimes waiting really is the better decision. Sometimes more preparation really is useful. The difficult part is knowing the difference. The question isn't whether every excuse is false. The question is whether the same excuse keeps appearing every time action becomes uncomfortable. Patterns reveal much more than individual thoughts. One excuse means very little. The same excuse repeated 20 times tells a different story. That's why paying attention to patterns is often more useful than analyzing individual thoughts. Your brain is incredibly good at producing convincing explanations. It becomes much less convincing when it repeats the same explanation every week. The next time you catch yourself thinking, tomorrow, or I'll start when things calm down, or I just need a little more research, pause for a moment, not because those thoughts are automatically wrong, but because they deserve a question. Is this genuine wisdom? Or is this simply another well-written story protecting me from uncertainty? Those two things can sound almost identical. The most convincing story isn't always the truest one. The goal isn't to become suspicious of every thought you have. That would be impossible. The goal is simply to notice a familiar pattern. If the same explanation appears every time you're about to do something uncomfortable, maybe the explanation isn't describing reality. Maybe it's describing resistance. And those are not always the same thing. That's why one convincing thought should never become a permanent rule. One delay doesn't define you. One excuse doesn't define you. But if the same explanation keeps showing up every time you're about to do something meaningful, maybe it isn't advice anymore. Maybe it's a pattern. That's why your brain is so convincing. And that's why learning to question your own stories is often more valuable than learning to silence them. Because the goal isn't to stop thinking. The goal is to notice when your thoughts quietly stop helping you and start protecting you instead.